Wanted to review how to bind a Les Paul, and binding a Les Paul definitely is one of the trickier things that you'll do because it's kind of unexpected. One of the hardest parts to bind on the Les Paul is going to be this horn. It's a real tight horn. It's tighter than a telly. It's tighter than a lot of different guitars, and if you're not prepared to do this bend and you start on this side, you'll end up screwing this up because you won't have the proper bend. What I've done when I bind Les Pauls is I've built a jig, and what this jig does is it creates a cutout of a Les Paul, and it's almost perfect size for the binding. So on my pin router I have a small pin on the top here and a large 1/4 inch bit on the bottom, and when I rounded this out, what I've got is essentially this perfect binding channel. So then what I do is I save the route out pieces here. I start with this bend right here. What you do is you take the binding and you start here and you bend it around, clamp everything down here with the screws, and then finish bending this right here. What I then do is I take the heat gun and I heat up the binding here to make sure it sits and it's formed. I'll let it sit for a couple hours, overnight usually. And then the next morning what I'll do is I'll pull out the screws, take the template off here, and I've got binding that's already semi-formed. So that way, when it comes to actually binding the guitar body, I've got all my blue tape strips set up here on my bench. I'll start with this spot right here, and I'll go around, and I'll glue all the binding, and I'll tape it. I'll use a rubber band or string here. This is a rubber strip from LMII. It's really good at holding binding down. And when I start with this section here and I go all the way around, what I'll do is I'll get to this last piece here, which is the trickiest, and I'll have my heat gun if it needs to be bent anymore, and what I'll do is I'll just heat this up slowly, bend it around, and then glue it here at the end. So here I've got a perfect bend around the horn, and it works out great. When you're using a heat gun, it's really important to make sure that you don't overheat the binding, because what will happen is you'll get some deformity on the binding. So what I do is I always just get my heat gun, I put it on its lowest setting, get it heated up, and so I heat the binding up by kind of just moving it slowly back and forth so I don't stay too long in one place. And over time you'll begin to see the binding gets very loose, as it heats up. And it'll be a lot easier to bend around these corners. And what happens if you stay too long in one spot, I'll show you here, you start to get bubbling. And I'm not sure if you can see that, but if you stay too long in one spot you'll get bubbles, and that's really not any good. So what you want to do is keep moving back and forth across the binding, and then when the binding becomes kind of playful here, you can see it's very loose. What you'll do is you'll go into your jig then and just drop it right in. What I'll then do is, like I said, let this sit overnight, and you'll get that binding perfectly in the spot. So as I start here, like I said, I always start in this corner, bend around this way, and then make sure I get that final corner at the end. So here, this is just sat for a couple of minutes, or a couple of seconds, and it's already got a nice pre-formed bend. That way, as you're going and gluing, it's not fumbling around. And the Les Paul binding is a lot thicker than normal binding, so you gotta be careful. It is a little bit intimidating at first. And I've screwed up enough Les Pauls doing the binding that this jig helps me out significantly. Always make sure you've got all your tape lined up here on the bottom. That way, as you are using the glue, it's much easier. You have access to pick up tape, pick up tape, pick up tape. There you go, that's how I bind a Les Paul.